Derivative, power rule, constant multiple rule. This is the very first three rules for the derivative, and it's very important to distinguish them so that when you do the calculation, it will be correct. Let's talk about the first rule of the derivative, which is called the power rule. The power rule's formula goes like this: d divided by dx, x raised to n power. And to take the derivative of this kind of expression, you bring down the n, and the x stays the same. As for the exponent, you minus 1. For instance, let's say that you need to take the derivative of x raised to 6 power. So according to the power rule, you always bring down the exponent first. So in this case, you bring down the 6 in front of the x variable. As for the exponent, you just minus 1. You always minus 1 according to the power rule. So 6 minus 1 equals to 5. Example 2. Let's say that you need to take the derivative of x raised to negative 6. So according to the power rule, you just bring down the exponent, and in this case it's negative 6. The x variable will always stay the same. And then as for the exponent, you minus 1, so it becomes negative 7. Notice that every time you take the derivative of this kind of expression, the number in front of the variable is always 1. If it's less than 1 or greater than 1, then you need to use another derivative rule. But since you recognize that the x variable in front of the number in front of this x variable is 1, so it's an indication that you can use the power rule. If it's any other number than 1, then you have to use another rule, which I'll cover later. Example 3. Let's say you need to take the derivative of x radical 16. So you bring down the exponent, which is radical 16 x, and radical 16 becomes 4. And as for the power rule, the exponent you always minus 1 by using the power rule. So it becomes 3. Now that I have talked about the power rule, let's talk about the constant rule. How do you recognize a constant rule? It's something like this. It's a k, which represents a constant. A constant is just a number by itself. If the problem asks you to take the derivative of a constant number, the answer will always be 0. For instance, take the derivative of 41. The answer will be 0. Take the derivative of 51, and the answer will be 0. Why is it always be 0? Because d divided by dx is the same thing as saying that y equals to 41. So when you graph it on a coordinate system, it will look like this. So the y will become 41, and when you take the slope of this graph, it will be 0. So that's why every time you take a derivative of a constant, the answer is always 0. Now that the one way to recognize a constant rule is that this expression is always going to be a number. There's no variable in it. If there's a variable in it, then you need to use another derivative rule. Now let's talk about the third rule of the derivative, which is called the constant multiple rule. And how do you recognize this rule? It's given in a form like this. Take the derivative of a constant times f of x. So to solve this kind of form, you take out the constant and you take the derivative of this function right here. For instance, let's say that you need to take the derivative of 1/3 divided 1/3 times x to the fifth. To take this derivative, you take out the 1/3 and you times by the derivative of x to the fifth. Notice that if you want to take the derivative of x to the fifth, you need to recognize that this is the power rule, which I have covered earlier right here. See, notice every time you take a derivative of this form, where the number in front of the x variable is 1 and no any other number than 1, then that means you can use the power rule by using this formula. And when you go back to this problem right here, you notice that this x, the number in front of this x variable is 1 and no any other number. So it's an indication that you can use the power rule. So 1/3 times, take the derivative of this expression, it becomes like this. And when you solve for it, the answer will be like that. Example 2 for the constant multiple rule. Let's say that you're given this problem and they want you to take the derivative of it. So one way, how do you know you use the power rule or the constant multiple rule? Well, notice that the number in front of the x variable right here is greater than 1 or less than 1. If it's just 1, if it's just an x and no any other number like right here, see, notice that there's no number in front of here. So it is an indication that it's a 1. If it's a 1 in front of the x variable, then you use the power rule. But in this case, there's a number in front, there's a number greater than 1 or less than 1. So that means you have to use the constant multiple rule. To use the constant multiple rule, you take out the 3 and you take the derivative of x raised to the 4th. X raised to the 4th is you take a derivative of it and you can use the power rule. So when you solve for it, it will be like this. So in summary, how do you know which rule to use? The power rule, the constant multiple rule, or the constant rule? So let's say you are given this problem. They ask you to find a derivative of all this. And you have to recognize that the number in front of the variable is 1. So that means you can use the power rule. If the problem is given in this form, like 2, 3, or any number, or like half or negative half, or negative 5 or 4, notice that it's not 1, then you use the constant multiple rule. If the given problem is given in this way, that you take the derivative of a constant number, then you use the constant rule. So it's very important to distinguish which rule to use by recognizing the given